Selamat pagi semua teman-teman. Selamat bertemu lagi di channel Jakarta Naikes. Hari ini tanggal 19 September berapa ini? 19 September 2024. Kita akan menyelenggarakan presentasi dari Human Rights Watch. Presentasi yang saya kira penting sekali. Presentasi mengenai laporan Human Rights Watch ini. Kalau bukan rasisme, menyebutnya apa? If it's not racism, what is it is? Ya, what is it? Gitu. Nah, di teman-teman di Papua ini ya, saudara kita di Papua ini mengalami banyak kekerasan selama puluhan tahun. Lebih dari 5 dekade mengalami kekerasan. Yang kemudian membuat warga di Papua juga bereaksi terhadap berbagai macam penindasan dan kekerasan itu. Dan salah satu akar utama dari berbagai macam kekerasan ini dalam hasil studi dari banyak sekali organisasi, termasuk pada hari ini adalah presentasi dari Human Rights Watch, itu akarnya dari rasisme. Ada kisah-kisah sehari-hari yang dialami oleh teman-teman Papua, misal di Jakarta. Di Jakarta itu banyak sekali teman-teman di Papua dianggap orang yang menakutkan gitu ya. Kalau mencari tempat duduk itu seringkali tidak dikasih atau enggan gitu orang kasih tempat duduk. Atau cari rumah gitu ya untuk disewa. Itu pemilik rumah itu cenderung enggan itu. Malas ah. Ada juga hal-hal yang mannernya gitu ya, orang-orang yang melakukan diskriminasi terhadap orang-orang Papua itu jelek sekali. Orang-orang Papua dianggap misalnya kurang bersih gitu. Itu kan menyakitkan sekali. Banyak orang kurang bersih, orang mana-mana kurang bersih, banyak juga yang bersih juga banyak gitu. Masalahnya adalah rasisme itu tadi. Melihat orang Papua ini lebih rendah, lebih tidak pinter, lebih tidak bersih, lebih menakutkan dibanding orang-orang lain. Ini adalah rasisme. Oke, kita akan memulai laporan ini sebentar lagi ya. Dan saya berharap semua pihak, baik masyarakat sivil, masyarakat bisnis juga, pemerintah, para pejabat itu mulai lebih sensitif lagi terhadap apa yang terjadi di Papua, apa yang terjadi terhadap warga Papua. Dan kita harus benar-benar membuat kultur human rights ini menjadi tegak ya. Human rights menjadi kultur, menjadi habitus, sehingga kita semua melihat sesama manusia, apapun rasnya, apapun agamanya, apapun jenis kelamin, orientasi seks, apapun negaranya, itu sama. Orang itu, manusia itu di mana-mana sama saja. Tidak ada yang lebih pintar, tidak ada yang lebih bodoh. Kita harus melihatnya dengan lebih baik. Up to you. Oke, kita mungkin sebentar lagi mulai, tapi mungkin juga mundur sedikit.
My name is Andreas Harsono. I'm working for Human Rights Watch on Indonesia. And next to my right is Cahyo Pamungkas. Pak Cahyo is the West Papua expert on West Papua from BRIN, Badan Riset dan Inovasi Negara. And on the right is John Shifton, the Asia Advocacy Director for Human Rights Watch, based in New York. I would like to start this news conference by saying thank you to the Communion of Churches in Indonesia, which own this building, especially the Papua Bureau. Pak Ronald Tapilatu is the chief of the Papua Bureau. Thank you so much for collaborating with Human Rights Watch in launching this particular report. I'm also thanking Lexi Rambadeta on the back of Jakarta Nikus. This event is being live streamed on the YouTube channel Jakarta Nikus. Thank you again, Lexi, who had been on this venue since 7 a.m. this morning, preparing everything. So basically, I'm going to summarize the content of this report, and then Pak Cahyo will provide the Papua roadmap. BRIN, or before that LIPI, is involved in trying to promote peace settlement in West Papua. And last, my colleague John Shifton, who will describe the international context of racism. Let me start by summarizing the content of this report. 5 years ago, on August 17, 2019, in Surabaya, a Papuan student university dormitory was attacked. The attackers were accusing the Papuan disrespecting Indonesia national flag. They are using insulting words. They kick on the door. They accuse of the Papuan to be traitors. It began noontime, but ended after midnight when the police attacked using tear gas to arrest 43 Papuan students, using really dirty words against the Papuan. The thing is, this is social media era. It was videoed, it went viral. And in the next 2 weeks, there were protests against racism and discriminations against people of Papuan origin in at least 33 cities all over Indonesia. The video was shared widely on social media, sparking a movement called Papuan Lives Matter, inspired by the Black Lives Matter protests in the United States. While the protests in all those 33 cities were largely peaceful, in some places there were clashes between communities, arson attacks, and even death. Indonesian police and military used excessive force and arrested many protesters, particularly targeting anyone who raised the Morning Star flag, a symbol of Papuan independence that is considered illegal in Indonesia. Papuan Behind Bars, the website that monitors politically motivated arrests in West Papua, recorded over 1,000 arrests in 2019 and 418 between October 2020 and September 2021. At least 245 people were convicted of crimes, including 109 for treason. Indonesia's laws against treason are mostly used to target indigenous Papuan campaigning for their rights, including for independence. Let me reiterate that Human Rights Watch take no position on claims for independence in Indonesia or in any other countries, but support the rights of everyone to peacefully express their political views, including for independence, without fear of arrest or other forms of reprisal. But in June 2022, just 2 years after the protest, the Indonesian parliament enacted a controversial law splitting the territory of two provinces, Papua and West Papua, into 6 new provinces. You can see the new map in this report with new capital, 4 new capital. In the past, Jayapura and Manokwari. Now we have Sorong, Nabire, Wamena, and Merauke as the new capital of the 4 new provinces. Many Papuan believe that creating this new administrative unit will bring more non-Papuan settlers, decreasing the proportion of indigenous Papuan living in their own land. Indonesian authorities have already encouraged and subsidized tens of thousands of non-Papuan settlers' family, or pendatang in Bahasa Indonesia, to relocate to West Papua through decades of transmigration program, often driving out indigenous Papuan and grabbing their land for mining and oil palm plantation. A statistic: in 1997, there were 1,678 villages all over West Papua. By 2021, before the latest pemekaran, there were 7,127 villages. It is a 4-fold increase. You might know in Indonesian, all land titles are stored on the village offices. If all those villages are split 4 folds in the last 5 decades, you can imagine the social administrative problem that Papuan have faced. Local and national authorities discriminate against indigenous Papuan in favor of settlers in delivering health services and education in West Papua. Areas with indigenous Papuan have far fewer medical clinics or puskesmas and school. The authorities also favor the pendatang, the settlers, in government job, whether as teachers, nurses, or in the police and military. Meanwhile, Papuan living in other parts of Indonesia, those who live in Jakarta, Surabaya, etc., Yogyakarta, encounter discrimination and racist tropes in gaining access to job, education, or housing. You might have read news report how difficult it is for Papuan students to find rumah indekos, rumah kontraan, housing in Yogyakarta or in Jakarta. Agus Sumule, a lecturer at the University of Papua in Manokwari, who led research on education in West Papua, noted much lower school attendance among indigenous Papuan in rural areas and found that there is not a single teacher training college in the Central Highlands, where almost all the residents are indigenous Papuan. He said, if it is not racism, what should I call it? And that is the title of this report. If it is not racism, what should I call it? Human Rights Watch also found that police torture and abuse Papuan activists using racist slurs. A video posted earlier in 2024 through social media showed 3 soldiers, Indonesian soldiers, brutally beating Devinus Kogoya, a young Papuan man whose hands were tied behind him and who had been placed inside a drum filled with water, taunting him with racist slurs. The fighting between Papuan pro-independence insurgents and the Indonesian security forces is contributing to the deteriorating human rights situation in West Papua. Indonesian security forces engage in arbitrary arrests and detention, torture, extrajudicial killings, and mass forced displacement. There are dozens of thousands of Papuan are now displaced, whether internally inside West Papua, in Duga, in Maibrat, but also along the border as refugees in Papua New Guinea border with Indonesia. And it's been going on since the 1960s until now. But many of these security officers over the last 6 decades are seldom held to account for these abuses. I repeat, 6 decades. The insurgents have been implicated in the killings of migrants and foreign workers, and right now have been holding a New Zealand pilot hostage since February 2023. Now I want to touch about President Jokowi. When he was elected president in 2014, many had hoped for human rights reform in West Papua. He released political prisoners. He also promised that foreign journalists can go unrestricted into West Papua. 10 years later, at the end of the president's second and final term, little has changed in West Papua. A new government led by Prabowo Subianto Joyo Hadikusumo will take office in October 2024. The new government should urgently review existing policies on West Papua, recognize and end the government history of systemic racism against indigenous Papuan, and hold to account those responsible for violating their rights. Of course, Indonesia is a party to core international human rights treaties, including the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. These treaties all prohibit discrimination based on race, ethnicity, and religion, among other grounds. The discriminatory policies and practices Human Rights Watch documented also continue violations of indigenous Papuan rights to health and education. Among key standards is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which recognize the rights of indigenous people to self-determination, including to autonomy or self-government in their internal local affairs. The Indonesian authorities should address the demands of Papuan activists and tackle the systemic racism against indigenous Papuan. The Indonesian government needs to finally recognize that international human rights law applies in West Papua and meet its obligation to the people there. My last statement, before I hand over to my colleague, I want to read the last paragraph on the last page of the report. We want to remember Philip Karma, the prominent Papuan activist and former political prisoner, a friend to Human Rights Watch, also my personal friend, who drowned in Jayapura on base G Camp Beach in November 2022. Thank you. Pak Cahyo, silakan.
Terima kasih. Okay. Thank you very much, Bapak Andres Arsono, for inviting me here. Ladies and gentlemen, selamat pagi. Good morning. My name is Cahyo Pamungkas. I am just a humble researcher in the Institute of Sciences or the National Research and Innovation Agency. First of all, I would like to say that this report is very excellent and very interesting. This report published by the Human Rights Watch this morning support and confirm and in line with the writing of scholars in academia. For example, I would like to quote the Chandri Mundru, anthropologist from Queensland University and Meki Betipo inside Indonesia. They introduced that the racism in West Papua, the idea we can call as the technocratic racism. It's the technocratic racism claims about the people skills, attitude, education, and or attitude for technical, professional, and entrepreneur work. Yeah. For example, I think this is stereotype in Indonesia that the West Papuan people are not good with technology. They like drinking. They cannot manage money or ashamed to do business. Malu untuk bisnis, or incapable to do business. They are good with money, technology, and business based on their cultural and ethnic background. So these are both forms of racism and racialization. As long as people believe that the skin color determine capabilities, behaviors, and motivations, way of thinking, then the racism will be persist. And also other academia like Ibu Camelia Webganon, she wrote in International Journal of Human Rights that in West Papua there's also happen industrial racism and industrial colonization. She said that the role that resource extraction, particularly mining and oil palm plantation, kelapa sawit dan pertambangan, play in enabling a form of racism in West Papua. This development of mining and palm oil plantation at the expense and the destruction of indigenous life. Yeah. This process relied on a dehumanization of indigenous people and an ignorance of their agency in determining their own needs. So the effect of resource extraction on cultural sustainability and its supplementation with industrial colonialization is a presented form of racism. So there are technocratic racism, and the second is industrial racism. And how racism works, yeah, either political or social, economic, and culture. So following the West Papua incorporation into Republic of Indonesia, colonial and pre-colonial representation of Papua as primordial, wild, and infantile Stone Age people, orang yang hidup di zaman batu, become institutionalized in the practices of government structures. The government policy of development or pembangunan always aim to civilize the Salvaga Papuan, untuk memperadabkan orang Papua from their backward, that also they frame Papuan as inept in the face of modernity, globalization, and technology. So in structural terms, racism manifests in institutional processes and practices and prioritize non-Papuan settler over Papuan in terms of employment, education opportunities, political position in the new order, and the financial income. So, and the last is why racism happened in West Papua. The first is, like the Sophia Chow wrote in Inside Indonesia, that race come into the equation, the Eurocentric perspective. So the discourse of race was introduced by the Dutch government, who insisted the Indonesian were Asia, while West Papuan are Melanesian. So this contribute to the perspective of racial inferiority that exists within Eurocentric world. As the racial narrative spread, they shape international perception on Papua. The portrayal of Papuan as primitive or underdeveloped in racial terms. And I think there are also many writing, like Ibu Veronica Kusumariati said that the Indonesia government and its supporter always denial. The government stated that Indonesia is a multicultural, post-colonial country whose foundation is not built on racial differences. However, or in contrast, the West Papuan argue that anti-Papuan racism or racism against West Papuan shape Indonesian nationalism and state formation, and that racism against West Papuan is part and a parcel of Indonesian colonialism in the region. So, epilogue, yeah. So, from our observation and research in the Brin or in Lipi, since 2009, 2008, racism has implications for persecutions, human rights abuses, impunity, injustice before the law, unequal access to public services, and the racism fosters the memoria passionis, the collective memory of suffering among West Papuan people, and also the racism against West Papua enhance the ideology of Papua Merdeka. So one way to end racism is to end Papua conflict itself. In our recent book, Updating Papua Roadmap in 2024 about human rights, the need to end, we write that the need to end violent conflict and human rights abuses by using option of non-violence, because the racism can grow under the ecosystem of political violence, conflict politik dan kekerasan. So we need to end the conflict, violent conflict and human rights abuse by using option non-violent approach by inclusive dialogue. The protracted conflict like happens in the West Papua or design conflict for particular interest in Papua land will enhance the crisis of humanity. So I think these are my conclusion, and it's already 5 minutes. Terima kasih. Thank you very much for listening. Selamat pagi.
try again just to see if it's closer, it's better. My name is John Sifton. I'm the Asia Advocacy Director at Human Rights Watch. I'm not here to talk about Indonesia or the Papuan Lives Matter movement so much as to raise some of the international context in which Papuan Lives Matter was born. I will switch to this. This microphone's almost good. So I'll just take a few minutes to raise some issues involving the international context surrounding this report. So a few initial points to add to the discussion. The report obviously documents abuses within the long historical context going back to Dutch colonial era and its ending in the 1940s and through early 1960s. But it's important to place the events documented in this report, especially since 2020, in the context of new, recent global efforts to address systemic racism, which have really changed. Those efforts have really changed in the last 3 or 4 years. There have been some major developments, which I'm going to run through very quickly. In the last decade, and especially since 2020, there's been a growing international attention to the need to better address systemic racism as a human rights issue. In particular, systemic anti-black racism, and especially anti-black racism in the context of law enforcement. And a key takeaway in this report is that racism, racism against people who identify as black, is typically uniquely demeaning and dehumanizing. These uniquely demeaning and dehumanizing aspects of anti-black racism have underpinned the Indonesian government's abuses against Papuans for decades. I mean, one can talk about autonomy, the Dutch departure from Indonesia, independence and separatism. These are not the issues we have written about. They're not within the mandate of Human Rights Watch, and we take no position on those issues. But we can say that the Indonesian government's focus on issues of separatism have distracted and overshadowed the underlying problematic issues that this report documents: systemic racism. Now, as my colleague Andreas noted, Papuan Lives Matter was inspired by the slogan Black Lives Matter, which first appeared in 2013 after a white man, George Zimmerman, was acquitted of killing a black man, Trevor Martin, a black child, I should add, in Florida. And Black Lives Matter protests spread in 2014 after 2 separate killings by police in the U.S., the shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, and the death of Eric Garner in New York City, who suffocated after a police officer put him in a chokehold. That's the context, the growing protests in incidents like that Papuan Lives Matter appeared in 2019. But the following year, Black Lives Matter really expanded dramatically in the US after anti-racism protests resumed and expanded dramatically after another killing of a black man, George Floyd in Minneapolis. Those 2020 protests were ultimately what led to some major changes in Geneva at the Human Rights Council to create new mechanisms and new approaches to anti-racism that the UN had never before embraced. I mean, of course, in the 1960s, there was a Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And in 1993, the UN created a special rapporteur on racism. And there were developments with respect to indigenous people's rights. After the Durban Conference on Racism in 2001, there was a lot of backlash from more powerful states, but a UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous People was created by the General Assembly. Unfortunately, though, developments on anti-black racism and anti-racism in general stalled in large part after 2001. All that changed in 2020 and 2021 after George Floyd was killed. Very quickly, Black Lives Matter in the US grew from a set of protests primarily by black African Americans to a set of national protests across the country in which tens of millions of Americans, not only black, but white, Asian American, even foreigners and tourists took part. And it became an international movement, truly an international movement at that moment. And in Geneva, the next year, the UN Human Rights Council created what is now known as the International Independent Expert Mechanism to Advance Racial Justice and Equality in the Context of Law Enforcement. That's a long name. We can call it the Expert Mechanism, or MLAR, as the acronym is often used. So MLAR was created initially to address, technically speaking, systemic racism against Africans and people of African descent. But that very quickly was expanded and generalized to talk about all systemic racism against, in the context of law enforcement, in particular anti-black racism, which I want to emphasize is not merely racism against Africans and people of African descent, but any persons who identify as black, which can include people who are not of African descent. So this new international context in which Papuan Lives Matter was born is now existing in a context in which these new mechanisms can be utilized. And so I guess we would like to strongly support that effort, that Papuan advocates can bring cases of anti-black racism in law enforcement to the attention of the Human Rights Council through both this special mechanism and the special rapporteur. And we invite the government of Indonesia, and this is probably the most important part, to invite the special mechanism members and the special rapporteur to visit Indonesia and address the issues raised in this report. I will leave it there for now.
Thank you, John Sifton and also Cahyo Pamungkas. I would like to open the floor for questions. Please raise your hand, introduce yourself. Pakai bahasa Indonesia juga boleh, saya bisa terjemahkan. We are using English because this is a global audience. We are having live streaming right now. Silakan, Wisnu.
My name is Wisnu.
Wisnu. Okay.
Hello everyone. My name is Wisnu from Amnesty International. I would like to ask John about Human Rights Watch previous research on racism. John, can you tell us more after this research? Is there like a red line that we can somewhat draw from patterns of racism happening in Papua and perhaps in the US or in the Europe? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So to complete on the international level where this fits in, I would say that, we want to emphasize how these developments have changed international attention. These developments I was talking about worldwide have changed international perceptions about anti-black racism to the point where we are conducting research on systemic racism and discrimination, not just specific cases, but systemic discrimination in the United States, in Europe, and in Brazil, and many other places. And I think that's what's going on here with these recent developments at the UN, is that while discrimination and racism were previously dealt with as issues of color blindness or specific instances, what we now see is a greater desire to look at it as a systemic issue. But the other thing is to get countries in which systemic racism is a problem to face a reckoning, where the society itself faces a reckoning. Now, I can't talk about Indonesia, but I can say that since Black Lives Matter appeared in the United States, one thing that millions of Americans, white Americans or non-black Americans, have realized that there is such a thing called systemic racism against black people, and that it exists. Too few people, but many people have recognized that. So if this report about Indonesia could succeed in one thing only in Indonesia, it would be inspiring and sparking a conversation in Indonesia about the existence of racism against Papuans in Indonesia and how much of a role it's played in these abuses. The beginnings of an admission that racism exists, and a start in Indonesia acknowledging and seeing that racism exists. Because as Andreas and I have discussed, here and everywhere, racial problems cannot be addressed unless they're seen and observed. And problems can't be solved until they begin to be understood. And to undertake remedies and attempt solutions requires that the government of Indonesia and large parts of the society of Indonesia admit to these underlying problems.
Please.
Thank you, Andreas. Laura Engel from the German Embassy here in Jakarta. Thank you so much for this presentation and this report. I think it's very important. And I kind of wanted to ask you, like, how you feel about. Of course, it's very important to eradicate, the underlying issues and have this discussion about racial discrimination. But is there also a move towards something like, affirmative action or like recognizing certain groups as indigenous groups? Is that something that you feel would be more helpful, or would that be like maybe just add to the problem? Because Indonesia so far doesn't speak, for example, of indigenous groups. So, is that a policy discussion that's also happening in order to address also these kind of issues?
Okay, thank you, Ibu. Yeah. In Indonesia, of course, there is a debate and movement to recognize the indigenous people. Like now, our government and the parliament still drafting the Undang-Undang Perlindungan Masyarakat Adat. What's in English? The Bill of Protection of Indigenous People, like that. And now the bill is still in the parliament and will be not yet finished to be discussed. Yeah. And also in Papua, there are also many movements to recognize the indigenous people. There are the West Papuan Customary Council, or Dewan Adat. There are also the Aliansi Masyarakat Adat Nusantara, the Nusantara Adat Alliance, the Nusantara Indigenous People Alliance that work in West Papua to recognize the basic right of West Papuan indigenous people. But until now, there's just limited recognition officially. We saw only in there is a Perda Desa Adat in Kabupaten Jayapura and Kabupaten Sorong. There's two regencies or two districts that their government succeed to legally recognize the so-called the Desa Adat or Adat village. But in the land of Papua as a whole, there is no progress for the recognition as indigenous people or masyarakat adat. Although the Papuan government in 2008 they issue the Perdasi, the special regulation to protection of the indigenous people, but also it is not yet implemented. But I agree with you that the recognizing the indigenous people in West Papua as well as in other islands in Indonesia, it will relieve the ethnocentrism or the racist attitude toward the indigenous people. But mostly in West Papua, racism is not only in political failure, but only in the mind, in the perspective. The West Papuan people, they are not able to conduct a business. They are corrupt, they are drinking, they are backward, etc. So all of the negative stereotype ascribed in the West Papuan people. And the law of special autonomy and also an extended special autonomy fail to protect the basic right of indigenous people. Now we observe, beside the political violence, also technocratic racism and industrial racism, mainly in palm oil and mining plantation. Like issue of land grabbing, like all eyes on IVU. There are so many cases. The industrial racism, as well as the technocratic racism, and also a political racism that happened in the land of Papua. I use West Papua meaning the land of Papua, bukan Papua Barat ya. Kalau Papua Barat is provinsi ya. The West Papua meaning the land of Papua, the whole of Papua. Okay, maybe you have a feedback.
Anyone else?
Sorry if you've already answered this question. I think I'm in a bad position. I don't really hear what you're saying all the time. But has the Indonesian government recognized your report in any way? You said that you have shared it with them. Has it been recognized? Have they said anything about it? If so, what? And if not, what do you expect the, their reactions to be?
We just released the report 40 minutes ago, but we are going to see some government official later today. But over the last 2 months, we had been trying to get feedback from the Vice President. You know that in Indonesia, the Vice President basically is in charge of West Papua, coordinating all ministries on West Papua affair. This is the only territory in Indonesia where the Vice President, or the President in this case, has to coordinate one territory himself. We are also going to see some other government official in the next few days, next week, and hoping that they will understand there are many problems in West Papua. They know that there are many problems, but they do not know how to synthesize, how to get their own biases, their racism, and over the last 6 decades. And we really do hope that this report will open a conversation, a dialogue, how to understand racism, discrimination, and other abuses against ethnic Papuan. And by only understanding the problem, we can try to find the solution.
I would just like to add that Indonesia is currently a member of the UN Human Rights Council until 2026. And we engage with them about other countries' human rights issues, including Myanmar and others, Palestine. And in that context, we will give the mission in Geneva this report too, while we call on the UN special mechanisms, the entities of which I was speaking at the Human Rights Council, to raise these issues with Indonesia as well at that level, with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, so that they can see that the problems in Papua make it difficult for Indonesia to promote human rights in other countries. But also to answer this question about remedies, I would just add that the thing about the Standing Forum on Indigenous Peoples' Rights and the Standing Forum to address racism and the other mechanisms is that what a remedy is and what justice is different in so many contexts. There are countering colonialism, there's countering the effects of the transnational slave trade. So reparations and justice mean a lot of different things for a lot of people, but none of this can even proceed to a talk about justice and remedies until governing bodies and authorities recognize systemic racism exists and start documenting it. My colleague in Europe, who focuses on systemic racism in Europe, talks about the need just to gather data and information about systemic racism. Indonesia could take a first step simply by admitting that there are problems and then gathering data and information about Papuan levels of education, economic development, and so on, just to get better information about the impacts that we've documented in the report.
Anyone else? Ronald, silakan. Minta tolong mikrofon.
Yeah, thank you so much for presentation. John, I think you follow all the situations of or human rights situations in Papua indicates. Yeah, I mean, we have after integrations, more than 15 years after integrations, the situations regarding human rights in Papua not changed. It's become worse and worse. I mean, if you look at the situations in the conflict areas in the highland, for instance, and that I just want to talk about refugees, IDPs, yeah? And related to racism and discriminations, my perspective is when we just focus on the issues about racism and discriminations without stopping the roots of problems, and racism and discrimination will going for, we don't know until when will stop. So you close with these friends who also discuss about racism and discriminations in Europe and in United Nations. I think maybe have to have big discussions about something to make clear for many friends and colleagues or other states to see the problems of racism and discriminations for Papuans, and really to do something, yeah, more big. And otherwise, we can make a report this every year in the same perspective. And this is something serious. So after this, because I know Andreas and then Cahyo, we are friends here, but we just think that all friends outside, they have to think how to stop this with using all the resources they have. Yeah. Otherwise, you will see the situations. There are two things of the policy of the state to stop the issues about Papua. First thing is make Papuan issue is just domestic issue. So no one can touch Papuan issue internationally. The second one is try to stop or prevent all the Papuan issue going internationally. So two kinds of this is also very difficult for Papuan to do something without support, big support. Yeah. And then, you know, the other one is when after the elections of the presidents, they changed the policy of name the group of rebellion of Papuan groups who fight for independence. They call KKB become OPM, yeah, Organisasi Papua Merdeka. It means that everyone who touch with the issues of Papuan can be linked, yeah, can be affiliated, yeah, they will make you a part of the movement for separatism issues. So this is something that also we still think how to manage this as a big issues that to stop, because it's also really hard, and yeah, for you know, outside of Papua, many people, students, they fight for the future, but in Papua, there are some students or young people, they fight for the future, following the regulations in this country. But many students, they don't have something for the futures. So this is something like a big gap, yeah, to see the balance of how to stop all these issues regarding human rights. Thank you.
Terima kasih, Pak Ronald. One problem that Human Rights Watch has repeatedly, for decades, calling on the Indonesian government and also other countries to end is restricting foreign journalists to go into West Papua. Also, international human rights monitors. That is a promise repeated over and over again by the Indonesian government that they will end that bad practice, but not deliver until today. That is like what Pak Ronald said, because Papua is being isolated as a domestic Indonesian issue, and people cannot talk about it outside of Indonesia. Meanwhile, things are going from bad to worse. Any other questions from the floor? We still have 10 minutes to go. John, do you want to add?
I think these initiatives at the United Nations Human Rights Council offer a new opportunity to raise Papuan issues on the international stage that didn't exist before. It's not just Indonesia's review under the Universal Periodic Review and things like that, or the Standing Forum on Indigenous Issues, which meets every April in New York. This is something new where these issues could really be brought to the attention of the rest of the world in a way that they haven't been until now. That's the possibility that I hope can be embraced here, and we will support Papuan activists who will seek to go to Geneva and to New York and raise these issues, because until the government of Indonesia gets more pressure from outside, we're not going to see any kind of major changes, I don't think. I'm not the expert on it. What I can say is the outside pressure can only help. I think you'd agree. Andreas, would you agree?
Okay. Anytime when special rapporteur come to Indonesia, just want to see what's exactly happened with the situations of human rights in Papua. They cannot go through to Papua. Just stop in Jakarta. So it's bullshit when they come and mentions about Papua without see by their eyes, yeah, exactly happened with issues of human rights in Papua. Yeah. So this is also the challenge for colleagues and friends who work in United Nations. Thank you.
There is one part of that in the report. Let me read. It's behind on the screen. The process for foreign correspondent to acquire official permissions to travel to West Papua has remained opaque and unpredictable. Also for Human Rights Monitor, Indonesian officials strongly resist what they call, quote, internationalization, unquote, of the West Papua issue, human rights abuses, environmental degradation, or land grabbing, and this underpins the official restriction to prevent independent foreign observers and UN monitors from visiting West Papua, even as Papuans remain desperate to expose the racial, economic, and social inequalities that they endure on a structural and everyday basis. And it's been going on for 60 years, my goodness. 60 years. Last questions? Yes, please.
Hello, am I audible? Okay. My name is Atika, and I'm from Amnesty International Indonesia. I'd like to give my 2 cents regarding the difference, maybe, between cases of systemic racism and debunking systemic racism, and how it's different in Indonesia. And I think it's because there's so much disparity between civilians of indigenous Papuans and people who don't live in Papua. And I think that especially in the George Floyd case, there was so much pressure by the netizens and by non-black peoples, and I wish, I guess, that we can find a mechanism for Indonesians to create this type of solidarity for an anti-racism movement to Papua, because whenever we talk about Papua, it's always been something very sensitive and something that we need to shoo away, I guess, in maybe if we talk about it in Jakarta. So I think that how do we disseminate this information to normal citizens, and how do we make it friendly for them to receive this information, so that actual discussions in public outside of forums like this, because we're probably 1% or 2% of citizens that actually care about this movement. So I think that that's also one step to look at regarding how do we bring this to normal citizens and in the general public. Thank you.
Boleh saya jawab pakai bahasa Indonesia aja, terlalu rumit kalimatnya. The complicated sentences. Ya, ya saya kira I will translate in English later. Bahwa kampanye laporan ini bisa menjadi saya kira lebih banyak untuk kampanye publik untuk fokus di dalam negeri di Indonesia ya, karena masih banyak masyarakat sipil di Indonesia yang belum sadar mengenai rasisme, diskriminasi maupun pengetahuan tentang konflik Papua. Yang kedua, sebetulnya ada persamaan antara bahwa kita harus melihat bahwa masalah Papua belum selesai karena Indonesia juga punya masalah ya. Indonesia is a post-colonial country, is chaotic coherently and systematic. Jadi sebetulnya baik di Papua maupun di Jakarta, tata kelola pemerintahnya itu sangat chaotic ya, coherently chaotic, and sama-sama chaotic ya, bahwa masalah pelanggaran HAM, rasisme dan discrimination and human rights abuses in West Papua, it is because the foundation of this republic is not strong ya, karena misalnya Indonesia, we don't have a tradition of law enforcement or equal before the law. Misalnya persamaan di depan hukum misalnya, itu kan masih sangat senjang ya antara elit dan antara massa atau antara kelompok-kelompok politik di Indonesia. Oleh karena itu saya kira menyelesaikan masalah Papua harus juga dilakukan dengan menyelesaikan masalah di Indonesia. Kita harus membuat Indonesia demokratik yang lebih berkeadilan, yang lebih menghargai hak asasi manusia. How do you translate in English?
Basically, Pak Cahyo said that to help the Papuans, we also need to help democratize Indonesia. The time is up now. We have to end this 1-hour news conference. Again, thank you so much for the audience who come here, and also the audience on the screen from Jakarta Nikus channel. Once again, I would like to thank the Communion of Churches in Indonesia, Persekutuan Gereja-Gereja di Indonesia, for hosting us in this venue. And of course to Pak Cahyo Pamungkas and John Sifton who come from New York to attend this news event. Terima kasih sekali lagi.
Thank you.